The rain fell steadily, painting the streets in a shimmering coat of silver as Daniel Harper pulled his old sedan into the parking lot of the county animal shelter. The windshield wipers swished back and forth, but the rhythm did little to calm the nervous flutter in his chest. He wasn't entirely sure what had brought him here. It wasn't a spontaneous decision exactly, but it wasn't something he'd planned meticulously either. Life had been a long series of empty days ever since Lisa, his wife of 30 years, passed away. The house they had shared felt like a cavern, every creak of the floorboards an echo of her absence. When a friend suggested adopting a dog, Daniel had brushed it off at first. "I'm not a dog person," he'd said. "Besides, I wouldn't even know where to start." But as weeks turned into months and the loneliness gnawed deeper, the idea started to take root. Maybe a dog wouldn't fix everything, but it might make the silence easier to bear. The shelter's door swung open with a faint creak, and Daniel was immediately met with a cacophony of barks and whines. The smell of wet fur and disinfectant filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of the rain still clinging to his jacket. A young woman behind the counter looked up and offered him a polite smile. "Can I help you find anything in particular?" she asked, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Daniel hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I'm just looking," he said. "I thought maybe I'd see if there's a dog that, might fit." The woman nodded, her smile softening with understanding. "Take your time," she said. "The kennels are straight ahead. Let me know if you have any questions." With a nod of thanks, Daniel moved down the corridor. The rows of kennels stretched out before him, each one housing a hopeful face. Dogs of every size and color pressed their noses against the bars, their tails wagging furiously. Some barked, others whined, and a few simply sat quietly, watching him with wary eyes. As he walked past, Daniel couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. These dogs had been abandoned, surrendered, or lost, and now they were here, waiting for someone to choose them. He stopped in front of a cage where a black and white border collie jumped excitedly, pawing at the bars. "Hey there, buddy," he murmured, but something about the dog's boundless energy made him move on. He didn't want a dog that would need too much. He barely had the energy to keep up with himself. It wasn't until he reached the far end of the room that he saw it. The kennel was small, and its occupant sat hunched in the corner, as far from the bars as possible. It was a bulldog with a broad, wrinkled face and a stocky frame. Unlike the other dogs, this one didn't bark or wag its tail. It didn't even lift its head at first, as if resigned to being overlooked. Daniel crouched down, resting his hands on his knees as he peered into the cage. "Hey, fella," he said softly. The bulldog stirred, lifting its head just enough to meet Daniel's gaze. And that was when he saw it. Tears. Actual tears streamed down the dog's face, leaving dark streaks in the fur around its droopy eyes. A low, mournful whimper escaped its throat, and it shuffled forward a few inches, its movements slow and hesitant. Daniel's chest tightened. He'd heard of dogs crying before, but had never seen it himself. The sight was both heartbreaking and deeply unsettling. He glanced around, half expecting someone to explain, but the room was empty except for the distant sound of another dog barking. "That's Wilson," came a voice from behind him, startling Daniel. He turned to see the shelter worker from earlier, now holding a clipboard. Her expression was kind, but tinged with sadness as she stepped closer to the kennel. "He's one of our longer residents. Came in about 6 months ago, after his owner passed away." Daniel looked back at the bulldog, who was now sitting a little closer to the bars, his big brown eyes fixed on him. "He cries like that a lot?" he asked. The woman nodded. "Almost every day. He's been through a lot, and I think he's still grieving. It's not uncommon for dogs to mourn when they lose someone they love, but Wilson," he took it especially hard. The weight of her words hung in the air. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked at the dog again. Wilson wasn't just sad. He was heartbroken, a living embodiment of the loss Daniel knew all too well. "Does he? Has anyone shown interest in him?" Daniel asked hesitantly. The woman shook her head. "Not really. Bulldogs aren't as popular as some of the other breeds, and his age doesn't help. He's about 7, so most people assume he won't have much time left. But he's a sweet boy. He just needs someone who's willing to be patient with him. Daniel felt a strange pull, like a thread tightening in his chest. He'd come here looking for companionship, for something to fill the void. And now, staring into Wilson's sorrowful eyes, he realized he wasn't the only one searching for something. "I'll take him," Daniel said, the words leaving his mouth before he could second-guess them. The shelter worker blinked, surprised. "Are you sure?" I'm sure," Daniel interrupted, his voice firm. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the bars. Wilson inched closer, pressing his wet nose against Daniel's hand. It was the smallest gesture, but it felt like a breakthrough. "Okay," the woman said, smiling faintly. "Let me grab the paperwork." As she walked away, Daniel stayed crouched by the kennel, his hand resting against the cold metal bars. "We'll figure this out together," he murmured. Wilson let out a small huff, his tear-streaked face tilting slightly, as if he understood. For the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. The drive home was quiet. Wilson sat in the passenger seat of Daniel's old sedan, his stocky body leaning against the door as he gazed out the window. His head rested low, the wrinkles on his face making him look perpetually forlorn. Daniel glanced at him every so often, unsure of what to say. It wasn't like talking to a person. Wilson couldn't respond. But something about the dog's silent demeanor made him feel the need to fill the empty space. "You're going to like it at my place," Daniel said, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "It's quiet, but peaceful. I've got a backyard, plenty of space for you to run around. Not that you look like the running type." He chuckled softly at his own attempt to humor, but Wilson didn't react. His large, expressive eyes remained fixed on the rain-speckled glass, watching the world pass by. When they pulled into the driveway, Daniel took a deep breath before getting out. His house was modest, a single-story brick home with a small porch and neatly trimmed hedges. It had been Lisa's pride and joy. Even after her death, Daniel had tried to keep it the way she liked it, clean, organized, and welcoming, though it felt far less welcoming now without her there. Wilson hesitated as Daniel opened the car door. He didn't leap out with excitement or curiosity like Daniel had seen other dogs do. Instead, he sat still, staring at the open door as if unsure whether he was supposed to move. Daniel crouched down, his voice soft. "Come on, buddy. It's okay. This is home now." After a few moments, Wilson finally slid off the seat, his paws landing heavily on the gravel driveway. He sniffed the air cautiously before following Daniel up the porch steps and into the house. Once inside, Wilson paused, his broad head turning slowly as he took in the new surroundings. The living room was cozy but plain, with a worn beige couch, a coffee table stacked with books, and a framed photograph of Lisa on the mantel. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and freshly brewed coffee. Daniel set down the bag of supplies the shelter had given him. Some kibble, a leash, and a few toys that Wilson had never touched. "This is it," Daniel said, motioning around the room. "It's not much, but it's home." Wilson didn't move. He stood in the middle of the room, his posture stiff, his eyes darting from one corner to the next. Daniel sighed and walked over to a corner where he'd set up a dog bed earlier that day. He patted the soft cushion. "This is for you. Nice and comfy." Wilson sniffed the bed once, then turned away and padded to the front door. He sat down in front of it with a heavy sigh, his back to Daniel. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a pang of uncertainty. He'd expected this to be an adjustment, but he hadn't anticipated how deeply Wilson's sadness would run. The dog's presence was palpable, like a physical weight in the room, but it wasn't the kind of presence that made things feel less lonely. If anything, it made the silence even louder. The first night was rough. Wilson refused to eat the kibble Daniel poured into the bowl, sniffing it once before retreating to his spot by the door. He didn't touch the water bowl either. Daniel tried coaxing him with a treat, kneeling down and holding it out in his hand. "Come on, buddy. You've got to eat something," he said, his voice gentle. But Wilson only glanced at him briefly before looking away. Daniel eventually gave up and sat down on the couch, watching the dog from across the room. He felt a knot of frustration building in his chest, not at Wilson, but at himself. What if this was a mistake? What if he wasn't capable of giving this dog what he needed? The shelter worker's words echoed in his mind. He just needs someone who's willing to be patient with him. He leaned back with a sigh, rubbing his eyes. Patience, he muttered to himself. Right? I can do that. The next few days were much the same. Wilson spent most of his time by the door, occasionally glancing out the window as if waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. He still wouldn't eat much, nibbling on a few bites of kibble here and there, but mostly ignoring his food. Daniel tried taking him for walks, thinking it might lift his spirits, but Wilson trudged along reluctantly, his head hanging low. One afternoon, as they walked through the neighborhood, a little girl riding her bike stopped to admire Wilson. "What's his name?" she asked, her eyes lighting up. "Wilson," Daniel replied, smiling faintly. "He's new. I just brought him home from the shelter." "He looks sad," the girl said, her tone innocent but direct. Daniel's smile faltered. "Yeah," he said softly. "He's been through a lot." The girl nodded solemnly before riding off, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. He looked down at Wilson, who was sitting on the sidewalk, his gaze distant. "We'll figure it out," Daniel said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the dog or himself. That evening, something shifted. Daniel was sitting on the couch, flipping through an old photo album he hadn't touched in years. It was filled with memories of Lisa, vacations, birthdays, lazy afternoons in the backyard. As he turned the pages, he felt a familiar ache in his chest. He looked up when he heard a faint shuffling sound. Wilson had moved. For the first time since arriving, the dog wasn't at the door. He was standing near the couch, his head tilted as he stared at the open album. Daniel blinked in surprise. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "What's got your attention?" Wilson inched closer, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. He placed one paw on the edge of the couch and leaned forward, his eyes fixed on a photo of Lisa holding a bouquet of flowers. Daniel's breath caught. It was a small thing, a fleeting moment, but it felt significant. He reached out, scratching behind Wilson's ears. "That's Lisa," he murmured. "You would have liked her." Wilson let out a low huff, his tail wagging ever so slightly just once. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough to make Daniel's heart swell. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to understand each other. The discovery happened on an unremarkable day. The sky was overcast, and Daniel had decided to tackle the attic, a project he'd been putting off for months. The space was dimly lit by a single dangling bulb, and dust motes floated lazily in the stale air. Daniel's task was straightforward. Go through the cluttered boxes, decide what to keep, and figure out what could be donated or thrown away. It was tedious work, but it felt good to have something to do with his hands, something that didn't involve staring at the empty space in his living room or wondering what Wilson was thinking as he stared out the window. Wilson, as usual, had stationed himself by the front door. He didn't follow Daniel up to the attic, seemingly uninterested in the man's latest attempt to keep busy. Daniel had grown used to the dog's quiet presence, though he still wished for more engagement, more joy, something to show that Wilson was starting to heal. As he opened one of the older boxes, Daniel uncovered a collection of items he hadn't thought about in years. Yellowing newspaper clippings, faded greeting cards, and a stack of photographs held together with a brittle rubber band. He smiled faintly as he sifted through the pictures. Most were snapshots from his younger years, back when life felt simpler. There were photos of backyard barbecues, neighborhood gatherings, and long-forgotten holidays. Then, tucked near the bottom of the stack, he found a photo that made him pause. It was a picture of his old neighbor, Mr. Fisher, standing in front of the little white house that used to sit next door. Daniel stared at it, a wave of nostalgia washing over him. He and Mr. Fisher had been friendly in a casual, neighborly way. They talked over the fence, exchanged Christmas cards, and shared the occasional beer on warm summer evenings. But what caught Daniel's attention wasn't Mr. Fisher himself. It was the small dog sitting at his feet. It was Wilson. There was no mistaking it. The Bulldog's distinctive face was instantly recognizable, even in the grainy photograph. Wilson had been younger then, his coat smoother, his frame a little leaner. But it was him. Daniel felt his breath catch as he studied the image, his mind racing to connect the dots. He shuffled through the rest of the box, uncovering more photos and documents. Among them was a letter from Mr. Fisher, one that Daniel had apparently kept but never paid much attention to. As he skimmed the lines, it all came flooding back. Mr. Fisher had written to thank Daniel for helping him with a minor repair years ago. He'd mentioned his dog, Wilson, in passing, something about how much the dog enjoyed sitting by the garden fence and watching the world go by. Daniel sat back on his heels, the photo and letter clutched in his hands. The pieces were starting to fit together. Wilson hadn't just belonged to some random person. He'd belonged to Mr. Fisher, a man Daniel had known, if only peripherally. And now, by some strange twist of fate, Wilson had ended up here in Daniel's home. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a coincidence. Wilson's reaction to him, the way he had cried at the shelter, the faint wag of his tail when Daniel showed him the photo album, it all made sense now. The dog had recognized something about him, perhaps his scent or his voice. Even after years apart, Wilson had found something familiar, something comforting in Daniel. Feeling a strange mix of emotions, Daniel climbed down from the attic and made his way to the living room. Wilson was still by the door, his head resting on his paws. Daniel sat down beside him, holding the photo in his hand. "Look at this," he said, his voice soft. "You remember him, don't you?" Wilson lifted his head, his ears twitching slightly. Daniel held the photo out, and the Bulldog sniffed it, his nose lingering over the image of Mr. Fisher. After a moment, he let out a low whimper and rested his head on Daniel's knee. "You've been carrying this with you all along, haven't you?" Daniel murmured, stroking Wilson's back. "You've been waiting for him." For a long while, they sat together in silence. Daniel felt a pang of guilt. Guilt for not realizing the connection sooner. Guilt for not doing more to ease Wilson's pain. But there was also something else, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. Wilson hadn't just ended up here by chance. Maybe they were both here to help each other heal. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself thinking more and more about Mr. Fisher and the bond he must have shared with Wilson. He remembered how the old man used to talk about his dog, always with a fond smile. "He's a good boy," Mr. Fisher had once said, patting Wilson's head as the dog lounged at his feet. "Keeps me company. That's all a man can ask for, really." Daniel found himself echoing those words now. Wilson was good company, even in his quiet, reserved way. And as the days turned into weeks, the Bulldog began to show signs of coming out of his shell. He started following Daniel from room to room, his stubby tail wagging faintly whenever Daniel spoke to him. He even began eating his meals with more enthusiasm, though he still preferred to sit by the door when he wasn't exploring the house. One evening, as Daniel was sitting on the couch, Wilson surprised him by hopping up and curling into a ball beside him. It was the first time the dog had willingly sought out physical closeness, and Daniel felt his heart swell. He rested a hand on Wilson's back, stroking the soft fur. "We're going to be okay. You and me," he said quietly. Wilson let out a contented sigh, his eyes closing as he relaxed against Daniel's side. In that moment, Daniel knew they had crossed some invisible threshold. They weren't just two lonely souls coexisting under the same roof. They were a team, a family. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was slow and steady, like the first signs of spring after a long winter. Wilson began to change in ways that were subtle but deeply meaningful. At first, it was the little things. His tail wagged more frequently, not just a faint twitch, but a genuine, joyful movement. He started greeting Daniel at the door when he came home from errands, his stout body wiggling slightly in excitement. The once silent house now echoed with the soft sounds of Wilson's paws padding across the hardwood floors, the occasional jingle of his collar, and the low, happy grunts he made when he sprawled out in a sunny patch of the living room. For Daniel, these changes felt like small victories, each one a reminder that they were both moving forward. Wilson wasn't the only one healing. Daniel found himself smiling more often, not the forced, polite smiles he gave to neighbors or the cashier at the grocery store, but real, unguarded smiles that came from somewhere deep inside. His days, once filled with a sense of purposelessness, now had structure. Taking care of Wilson gave him a reason to get up in the morning, to go outside, to engage with the world again. One afternoon, Daniel decided it was time for something new. He clipped the leash onto Wilson's collar and led him to the car. "We're going on an adventure today," he announced, his voice light. Wilson tilted his head, his ears perking up slightly at the unfamiliar tone. The drive was short, just 10 minutes to the local park, but it felt monumental. Daniel parked the car and opened the door, watching as Wilson jumped down with surprising eagerness. The park was sprawling with winding trails, open fields, and a small pond surrounded by willows. Families picnicked under the trees, children laughed as they flew kites, and dogs of all shapes and sizes roamed the grassy expanse. Wilson sniffed the air, his nose twitching furiously as he took in the unfamiliar scents. His tail wagged in short bursts, a sign of tentative excitement. Daniel couldn't help but smile. "Come on, let's see what this place has to offer." They walked the trail together, Wilson's leash taut as he pulled ahead, his usual cautious demeanor replaced by curiosity. He stopped to sniff every tree, every bush, every rock. When a golden retriever bounded over to greet him, Wilson stiffened at first, his body going rigid. But after a few moments, he relaxed, his tail giving a small wag as the two dogs sniffed each other. It wasn't much, but it was progress. By the time they returned to the car, Wilson was panting happily, his tongue lolling out of his mouth. Daniel ruffled the fur on his head. "You did good today, buddy," he said. Wilson let out a soft grunt, leaning into the touch. Back home, the days began to fall into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were spent walking through the neighborhood, where Wilson had become something of a local celebrity. Neighbors stopped to greet him, commenting on how much happier he seemed. Afternoons were for lounging in the backyard, where Wilson liked to roll in the grass or doze in the shade of the old oak tree. Evenings were quiet but warm, with Daniel and Wilson sharing the couch as the TV played softly in the background. Despite the newfound peace, there were moments that reminded Daniel of how far they'd come. One evening, as he was sorting through a box of Lisa's belongings, he found himself overcome with emotion. He held one of her scarves to his face, breathing in the faint, lingering scent of her perfume. The grief, though no longer as sharp as it once was, still cut deep. Wilson, who had been lying nearby, seemed to sense Daniel's sorrow. He got up and walked over, resting his head on Daniel's lap. His warm, steady presence was grounding, and for a moment, Daniel simply sat there, one hand gripping the scarf, the other resting on Wilson's back. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Wilson responded with a soft huff, his brown eyes filled with a quiet understanding. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel and Wilson became inseparable. They celebrated small milestones together. Wilson learning to play fetch, though he mostly just chewed on the ball. Daniel cooking a meal without feeling the familiar pang of loneliness, the two of them venturing further on their walks each day. Their bond was deep and unspoken, built on shared moments of joy and comfort. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel decided to visit Mr. Fisher's old house. It wasn't far, just a few streets over, but he hadn't been there in years. The new owners had painted the shutters a cheerful blue and planted flowers along the front walk, but the house still carried echoes of its past. Daniel stood on the sidewalk, Wilson sitting obediently at his side. "This is where it all started for you, huh?" Daniel said, his voice soft. He thought about knocking on the door, explaining the strange connection he now shared with the Bulldog at his feet. But something stopped him. The past felt like a closed chapter, one that didn't need reopening. Instead, Daniel crouched down, scratching behind Wilson's ears. "We got a good thing going now, don't we?" "We're doing okay." Wilson's tail wagged in agreement, and Daniel felt a warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in years, he felt whole. As the seasons changed, so did their lives. Winter brought snowy walks and evenings spent curled up by the fire. Spring came with blooming flowers and trips to the park. And through it all, Daniel and Wilson were a team, each finding solace and joy in the other's presence. In the quiet moments, Daniel often thought about how much Wilson had given him. He had come to the shelter thinking he was the one doing the rescuing, but in truth, it was Wilson who had saved him. The dog had pulled him out of the darkness, reminded him of what it meant to love and be loved. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set, Daniel spoke aloud, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Wilson, to Lisa, or to himself. "You know, I think we're going to be okay. Better than okay, even." Wilson leaned against him, his eyes half closed, his breathing steady. Daniel smiled, his heart full in a way he hadn't thought possible. In the end, it wasn't about what they had lost. It was about what they had found in each other, in the quiet moments, in the simple act of moving forward. And that, Daniel thought, was more than enough.